the beginning of the week. So I'm going to talk about using narrative in research. And basically what I'm going to talk about is a number of techniques that you can use to elicit stories from participants, essentially, to either find out about their everyday lives or to understand how they might be experiencing a technology.
Can you speak more about?
Yeah. Sure. So the aims for today, I'm going to go over a number of these techniques. We're going to try and understand when and why you would use them, and perhaps how you combine them. And I'm also going to do some practicing. So I'm hoping that the afternoon session especially is going to be a bit more interactive. And we'll all be using some of these techniques and trying them out on each other. But I wanted to begin by kind of drawing a distinction between what I'm going to talk about and this, narrative analysis. So some of you might have heard of narrative analysis, I'm not sure. Narrative analysis is a way of dealing with data. So it's a particular approach to qualitative analysis. And really in narrative analysis we're concerned with the structure, the content and the function of the stories we tell. So narrative analysis looks at things like identity, it looks at things like social interaction. It's not really interested in whether the stories are true necessarily, it's looking at the uses that they're put to in kind of sociology and psychology research. It's based on the premise that we live in a storied world and we interpret the actions of others and of ourselves through stories. So we make sense of the world through stories. Narrative is kind of a natural way for us to make sense of the world. And really it was a reaction against a kind of atomist trend in cognitive psychology. So an idea that things are being broken down into kind of small pieces rather than a holistic view. So narrative is really an attempt to be more holistic. So Brunner describes this by saying, people do not deal with the world event by event, they frame events in larger structures. He describes it as a central human means of making sense of the world. Now, like I say, we're not going to go into the details of narrative analysis. It's something that cognitive psychologists use, for example. It's something that's used in sociology. It's something you may want to look into more, especially if you're doing research on topics like well-being. But I think there are some really interesting ideas in here. So, for example, the idea that we live in a storied world, the idea that stories are a good holistic way of making sense of the world, means that there are things in there that we can borrow. So, techniques that use narrative. These are the things I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to begin with something which is very much about gathering stories from participants, so the critical incident technique. And then I'm going to talk about diaries as a way of kind of collecting data which you might use to prompt narrative and what that might lend or what that might add to a diary study. I'm going to talk about cultural probes as ways of telling stories and building dialogue. And I'm also going to talk about some of the prompts you can use in interviews, prompts which maybe have borrowed from cultural probe studies, so things like maps, tours, different ways of kind of getting your participants to tell you stuff. And I'm going to finish with a little bit on user-generated data. So obviously with Web 2.0 we now have a wealth of data online, some of which is in narrative form, some of which is, for example, videos or songs, or perhaps things you don't really think about as data or narrative, but perhaps you might begin to think about as data and narrative. So we're going to end just by thinking what possibilities are there. So the critical incident technique is the one I want to begin with. This is perhaps the technique which is most explicitly about narrative. And it's quite a straightforward technique. Basically, you ask people to describe a critical incident, something that stands out to them. It might be a particularly significant experience they've had of the technology, so it might be the most satisfying experience or the most remarkable experience. It could be a negative experience, so it might be something catastrophic happened when they were using something, or some error they experienced. And obviously these are drawn from memory, so these are not kind of like the experience sampling approach that you learned about earlier in the week. This is about casting your mind back and producing a narrative. And storytelling is effective here because it's a good way of getting a holistic view of that experience. So it enables things like the place and the time. Often these are naturally brought into stories. What you were doing, what happened next, what preceded it, who else was around, what information you had to hand. Often these things are naturally kind of brought in when people tell stories. So the idea by using this technique is that you begin to get all of this other rich data as a kind of side effect of asking someone to tell you a story about a particular incident. So an example of some researchers who use this technique are Olsen and Fallow. They have a CLI paper from 2012, which is called Satisfying and Unsatisfying Experiences of AR technology. So they were particularly looking at kind of early adopters of AR at a time when AR was really augmented reality. You all know what augmented reality is, right? No?
So you didn't get that one.
Sorry. They're looking at users of augmented reality applications, so things like Google Goggles or Layer is another one that came up quite a lot in their data. So these apps, quite early apps, where people were beginning to develop augmented reality experiences. And they were interested in kind of collecting narratives of those experiences. So what were the most satisfying experiences people had had with these technologies, and what were the least satisfying? So what kind of frustrations have they experienced? And they did this, they wanted to get quite a large number of narratives, so they collected these using an online survey, which they distributed through like webmail and web groups that were interested in AR. So they looked for these people who were like early adopters, early AR users. The aim here was to understand the activity or the goal that the participants had had, the characteristics of the experience, and the features of the application that might have underpinned that experience. And they were also very interested in context, so they used narrative as a way of tying in these experiences to contextual factors and the other activities that the user was doing, and also cultural influences. They also complemented this sort of request for a narrative with a survey. So they asked people to describe some critical incident that they'd experienced, and then they asked them to complete a survey which measured aspects of the experience. So looking at things like Passensals, pragmatic and hedonic experiences, for example. They looked for those things via a complementary survey. I'm not going to go much into how you would analyse this kind of data today, but I just want to sort of highlight grounded theory. Have you learned much about grounded theory during this course? A little bit? Yeah. So just to kind of say why this is particularly relevant here. Now when you do this kind of study, yes?
No.
Oh, you were just distracting. Okay. Yeah, when you do this kind of study, often you kind of go into it with a very open-ended question, like what is the most satisfying and least satisfying experience? This is an extremely open-ended question you're asking your participants. So often you have to accept that you're not really going to have a set of categories that your data is going to slot into. You have to develop those yourself. And often the way of doing that is to use grounded theory, where your analysis is very much data-driven, comes from the bottom up, rather than just simply classifying things and putting them in boxes. So, just to kind of recap, in case this is a bit new to some of you, with grounded theory you begin with a kind of round of open coding, where you basically go through the data and look for things which are standing out as a way of almost summarising your data in code form. So you look for the points which are beginning to surface. You link these together with a round of axial coding, so you look for how your data begins to cross-link across participants and within narratives as well. And then you begin to develop your theory, so you do a round of selective coding where you begin to really pull things out and decide what's of interest to you. Now your theory might be a set of categories, so you might produce from a round of grounded theory a number of categories which you can then use to classify your data. And that's what Olsen and Fallow did. So they used grounded theory to construct a set of categories which they could use to describe these experiences. And then they looked at the survey that they'd taken of aspects of experience, like hedonic aspects or pragmatic aspects, and looked to classify them within that. Okay. So what kind of findings might you get out of a study like this? Well, they noted that the particularly satisfying experiences that people had had with augmented reality apps were often to do with pragmatic aspects of experience. So they were useful, they were seen as empowering the user, they were seen as lending an air of efficiency to something they were doing. So for example, it might be the case that people would report an incident where they'd used a map layer which had allowed them to understand where they were very quickly, or had allowed them to find a restaurant nearby, or had allowed them to understand where they were if they were on a historical site. So these are all kind of sort of useful things, really, things which are efficient or empowering or heighten awareness. They also had lots of reports of the kind of emotional experience of using these apps, especially when they were very new, so the kind of amazement that, you know, if it was working well, that you might have this layer that would tell you something about the world. People talked about amazement, excitement, and surprise. And sometimes they talked about being immersed in this kind of experience, so elements of immersion also sometimes appeared in these narratives. Unsatisfying were a bit more kind of mundane things, really, so just things not working, being frustrated when there's a lack of data, or not being able to complete a task, or something not quite working, small functionality problems. So what was quite interesting here is that you can see the possibilities of this technique lended to this study. It allowed Olsen and Sallow to understand the existing state of the art, if you like, in AR. What is the current landscape like? But it also allowed them to begin to suggest opportunities of what to do next. So coming back to Hassan-Zal's distinction between pragmatic and hedonic experience, they noted that there was very little hedonic experience supported by these apps, or very few reports where people talked about apps which were related to their identity or that evoked memories. We think that AR, there's a lot of potential there for drawing on memories and locating them in space, but there was very few reports of apps that actually provided that kind of experience, so evoking memories, evoking emotions, relating to your identity as a person. These are very limited. And there was also, it also highlights things where, other spaces where you might begin to explore, so for example, looking at immersion rather than just narratives around vocation was also thought to be lacking. Some of the limitations of this technique, obviously you're looking at critical incidents, so you're not looking at everyday things, and you're not looking at things which may fly below the radar somehow. So things like play or creativity, sort of silly experiences might not really be reported with this kind of technique. Maybe social interaction, if an app supported you talking to your friend, maybe that's not going to make it as a critical technique that you might report in a narrative in a survey. Implicit and seamless interactions, so things which are just the backdrop of your everyday life, things which just kind of blend into the background, kind of ubiquitous, pervasive computing, which is the goal for many of these applications. Perhaps those things aren't going to be identified using this kind of method. And then, of course, you need to justify the fact that you're relying on memory. So you're not doing something like experience sampling or a diary study where you're asking people to report things constantly. You're asking them to cast their mind back and tell you what happened maybe 3 months ago. So how reliable is that resource? So Olsen and Fallow justify this by saying, well, memory is important. For example, if you're going to make a new decision to acquire a new AR app, then you're going to rely on your memory. So there might be instances where memory is interesting to you, but you need to recognise that this is a weakness of this technique, and maybe you need to balance it with other things. And of course, all techniques have limitations, so balancing is important. So things you might balance a critical incident technique with would be something like a diary study or an experience sampling study, where you're basically trying to gather narratives about the everyday, so the things which might otherwise fly under the radar. Of course, with diaries, you can record something. You could ask the user to record what they're doing on a daily basis, or perhaps whenever a particular event happens. So it might be every time they go online, you want them to do a certain, you want them to record their situation. With experience sampling, I think you've already covered, so I'm not going to really go into it. But again, these are kind of prompted ways of gathering data. So you gather data when you're kind of triggered to do so by some kind of app or some kind of external stimulus, which is basically controlled by the researcher. So I want to give you an example of a study which I did with some of my colleagues, where we basically gathered narratives about web use in a very mundane, everyday context and tried to expand some of the existing frameworks that existed about how people use the web, basically. So in this study, we basically wanted to expand a number of web taxonomies which already existed, which were basically ways of categorizing web activity. So there were plenty of frameworks for understanding how people use the web, which look at things like whether you're communicating or whether you're doing some kind of transaction, like perhaps you're buying something, whether you're browsing, whether you're searching for something specific, or whether you're kind of just consuming information. So maybe you're watching a film or something. So people use the web in very different ways. And there are these existing categories that look at these, but most of them are kind of pre-mobile, pre-Web 2.0, and we thought maybe they needed updating. So we decided to do a study whereby we used diaries, a bit of affinity diagramming, and in-depth interviews. And it's the interviews that I really want to focus on, because they were where we kind of gathered narratives about these activities that helped us kind of expand quite differently the existing frameworks. So this is kind of an example of one of the diaries that we gave out. So what's happening here is that we had participants who were asked to keep a diary of their web use for a week. They were asked every time they went online to describe what they were doing, what prompted it, what happened next, what they looked at, so what was the website, or websites, what they were using, was it a computer, a laptop, a mobile phone, etc., and when it was and how long it took. So it's quite a simple diary, but obviously it's always time-consuming to complete these kind of things. And really doing this helped us get to, first of all, it helped us get to a different level of data that we'd get if we were using a log. So, for example, this person talks about how he's looking at Google Street View. And if I was looking at a log of data, I would probably imagine that he wanted to go somewhere. He was looking for an address, maybe he wanted to navigate to a place. What he's actually doing, he's written that he's had a comment from a friend on Facebook about an old flat they used to live in, and he wanted to go and look at it. So his reasons are much more about nostalgia. They're very different to the kind of things you might infer just from looking at data. What we did after we'd asked participants to collect these diaries was we got them to talk through each incident, so tell us a story about each incident in this diary. And while they were doing that, I would write down basically a summary of what the incident was on a post-it note. And at the end of the interview, I got them to do an affinity diagram, so they organised all their post-it notes into categories. What was quite interesting here was things like email, which traditionally in web taxonomies or taxonomies of web activity, traditionally that's communicating. Email is about communicating. That's what you do with email. So this person has got email in 3 categories, which are completely different. And they're basically different ways of using email. Some of them are about entertainment, some of them are about keeping in touch with friends, and some of them are about killing time. So when we talked to her, this is the kind of thing she said. So she talked about email as something that she would look at when she was waiting for a response on IM. So maybe you've experienced this yourself. You're talking to someone on IM and you're waiting for them to finish what they're saying so you can say your next bit. And you do something else while you're waiting. So you do something very quick. It's not something that you can really get involved in or get immersed in or get distracted by, but it's something that you can do very quickly while you're waiting for something else to happen. And she talked that she would also do this, for example, if she was stuck at work. She would quickly look at her email and then go back to what she was doing. When we asked her a bit more about this, she talked about how she would get annoyed if she found an interesting email in her email inbox while she was at work and she was doing this kind of clicking thing. So if there was an email from her mother, she didn't want an email from her mother when she was at work. She wanted it when she was at home and she could have the mental energy, if you like, to invest in responding and thinking and reading. So this was a kind of weird thing. This is not communicating. This is taking a break, sort of. It's a bit like looking out the window. It's a bit like doodling. It's like many other things which are not really anything to do with the traditional web taxonomies that existed. And lots of people did this, and some people went to work and set up what they called a procrastination window, which was a web browser where they especially opened lots of things like news sites or Facebook or whatever that they could look to and quickly read and then close down. So this was an actual practice that people supported. They built their technology around it to support this kind of thing. So we called this respite, which basically means like escapism. And it was really one of the, we called it a mode of web use. So it's almost like a frame of mind you're in when you're using the web. And it was one of the things that really set us off on a different path to producing a very different framework of types of ways that people use the web to those that were already existing. But it was really important that we had these narratives. So what I really want to press home here is that these narratives were kind of essential in helping us understand this. If we just use the diaries or if we looked at a log, then there's no way we would have got this kind of information. We wouldn't have got these stories about how people use the web, and we wouldn't have been able to interpret this in a different way. Okay. So, what I want you to do now is just spend 5 minutes having a bit of a think about the advantages and the limitations of these techniques. Now, do you remember enough about experience sampling to be able to do this? I know you covered it this week, so I didn't want to just kind of repeat it, but it's basically, diaries are about recording stuff at the end of the day, so or when something happens. And experience sampling are about recording information when the researcher prompts you. So it might be every time you open an app you get prompted, or it might be at random intervals of the day you get prompted to answer a series of questions. Do you feel able to do this? Yeah? You can do it in pairs if you like.
The advantages and the limitations of narrative science.
Would you like to think about it together?
Sure. Okay.
Tak, to może być ciekawe.
First thing that comes to mind for me is that diaries, because they are filled in at the end of the day, you have this remembering bias. Because after a day you are already reflecting on certain things. Maybe at that point you found it really annoying or negative, and later on you think it's a really good thing.
You're not that good either.
No, fewer details.
Because this is very rich in design.
I think this is they don't have time to reflect, but it can be a good thing as well. I mean, this
This is like samurai in general. It's wavy.
yes.
Yeah.
So this is really live, which means you get the excellent experience. I think this might be really disturbing as well.
This black period. In sense of the day or also in sense of the week or a couple of weeks. Doing experience something for a couple of weeks is probably very interesting.
Yeah, you can do this for a longer period.
This is more of the stories, and this is more of what it is experiences. Like this is here. This is more narrative.
And you also think so.
This is
I think you'll
zoom point. Some narrative.
Yeah, because I think they are able to explain what happened there. But it's probably very hard to explain it here to make a story and tell people how it happened and why. I think it's
Yeah, like I mean, this is sort of an anchor point for
yeah, it could be. Yeah. Actually, my colleague used this on asking people to carry their diary with them.
Yeah.
So the whole day and write in it every time they came across certain things. So it's not really the classic way of using diaries.
Okay, so
I now
it's
notice
somewhere here.
it's somewhere in the middle.
And how it works for him? Yeah.
There are a lot of people who fill out.
Does anyone want to shout out some advantages of these techniques that help you kind of used to it every day?
For the diary, it's easier to record the evidence from the user. This is the advantage, and disadvantage is for the researcher. They have to go through all the stories, and the feedback form is her idea. Each and every course we have to, as a student, we have to give some feedback for the course. It's a one kind of narrative. Almost that type of
No, it's to say that it's a form of narrative, feedback forms in general.
Yeah.
Just collect.
Yeah, I guess it's quite open-ended.
Yeah.
And one disadvantage for the researcher as well, that each and every time if I have to record something, it's a kind of evidence. So in some cases I might lie.
Yeah, then you are bound by
But,
this.
yeah, but if you provide some questionnaire or some other form of without any with anonymous name, then I might tell true all the time. That's one of
Okay, so you think maybe the fact that you're identified might lead you to lie or maybe a hint?
Yeah.
So,
At least for the course feedback, I always, if there is a name for that, I always write the good, very good, very good, very good. Although I sit all the time in the class. I don't like at all. But I do that one because I don't trust the technology. I know that it's easier to find out who knows, who gives the feedback, negative feedback. It's very easy.
I think expression something is the advantages. I think that the feedback is more brief. Possibly it's like yes, no. Whereas diaries is more time consuming.
Yeah, so there's definitely a kind of labour in writing in the diary every time you have to do something. And maybe remembering to do that as well. So.
We were thinking that diary participants might prioritize. So the experience sampling can be event-based, but with diaries, especially the long-term, sort of several weeks, the participants prioritize what is meaningful to them, and you can also read, okay, when do they actually write something, because the other ones are with notification. But on the other hand, the disadvantage is, of course, they might forget. So some interesting experience might get lost because they just
Yeah, so they're kind of deciding what goes in,
yes.
which can be an advantage, but maybe problematic if they've decided something's not interesting to you, but maybe it is. And then you're relying on memory again. So a bit like the critical incident technique actually, so it kind of almost a bit of a continuum there where you begin to rely on memory, you begin to get the most important things in there.
I think as a diary, it depends if it's a little bit structured, like semi-structured diary, or completely unstructured diary. So if there are questions, it's easier for participants to answer the questions. But if it's open, if the diary is open, then we don't know what participants will write. So then there is maybe not the problem, but data analysis is very, very difficult because we get different types of data from different participants, and I think the role of moderator is crucial. If there is somebody who can ask, maybe not the best is everyday question, how are you and how's going today, can you write something, maybe to ask some questions, then participants don't give up and they write, otherwise it's difficult to survive the very long study and keep writing.
Yeah, so participants might run out of steam a bit as well and begin to tail off in their participation. Yeah, and you've got to decide when you sign your diary how you're going to analyse the data. What's going to be.
Yeah, and I also noticed that the form of the diary is crucial. There are differences if we can use notebook or there is the blog or maybe different form. And there is the relation between the ability to use the blog, for example, or notebook. It's easier, but then the researcher doesn't have control with what's going on in the notebook.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's more open-ended with a notebook, and I suppose you can't check in and see what's happening.
Yeah.
So with an electronic diary, you can see it, but give it up.
Yeah.
I think, I hope nobody told it, because some people speak so quiet that it's hard to hear here. But I think one of the advantages in case of diaries is that you get those moments from your day which are important for the person. And there's a big thing with memory connected, which you tend to forget unpleasant moments, and so you get big picture. But in second case experience, you get just an exact moment, that experience, which maybe after 5 minutes or 1 hour, the person will forget. This is very important if you need some specific experience, because people are forgetting a lot of stuff. If you will think in the evening, you will not remember a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
This is normal. This is human nature.
Yeah. So we forget lots of things about our daily lives, like the commute to work. You're not really going to remember that in very much great detail. when it's the evening, but if you're triggered to report something at that time, then you might describe it much more accurately. Okay. Any last contributions? Yes.
Yeah, I would just mention related to previous remark, maybe if you're writing a diary by the end of the day or whenever, then you just have more time to actually reflect on what has happened versus being prompted in an unexpected moment and just needing to write something very quickly. So this reflection is also valuable, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it really depends what you're after as a researcher. If you want a reflective, deliberative account, then maybe a diary is going to suit you better. But if you want to be a bit more accurate and to be a bit more confident that you know what's happening at a particular time or when something in particular is happening, maybe experience sampling would be more useful. Okay. So yeah, I just thought I'd add a couple. So yeah, like we touched on, memory bias begins to creep in. But actually with all of these, but especially with experience sampling, you're less, with experience sampling, memory bias is less of a difficulty, whereas with diaries, you can be a bit more expansive, so you can, for example, you might not be tied to a particular technology or particular app. So with experience sampling, often I might try and work out what you're doing as you open your Facebook app on your phone. With a diary, I can say, okay, what about Facebook on your website? What about Facebook on your friend's laptop, etc. So you might be a bit more broad. Both of them give you an insight into routine behaviour. And both of them can work across context, can engender reflection, and can give you an insight into experience. Disadvantages, I think for both of them, they can be quite time-consuming and irritating for your participants, and that might begin to change the way they interact with them and the things they report. And another disadvantage is in this reflection. So for example, with the web study that we did, people began to be very aware of like how often they were checking Facebook or how often they were checking their email when they should be at work. And that's not always something you want to happen when you're trying to understand what people are doing, because it can obviously lead to their changing their behaviour. So you have to balance these things, and as with all techniques, it's about balancing and deciding what's most important to your research question. Okay. So I wanted next to talk about cultural probes, which is quite different to some of the things we've been talking about so far, and quite a diverse technique. So this is Bill Gaber's description from the first paper in which he described cultural probes. These packages of maps, postcards, and other materials were designed to provoke inspirational responses from elderly people in diverse communities. Like astronomic or surgical probes, we left them behind where we had gone and waited for them to return fragmentary data over time. So quite a different approach to data collection. And I'm not sure if have you all come across cultural probes, or is this completely new to some of you? This is completely new to anyone? New? Yeah, okay. So the things so basically to get a bit more context, in this project it was an EU project where Bill Gaber and a group of his colleagues were working with elderly people to try and develop some technologies to kind of support community, I suppose, to help them feel a better part of their communities. And their participants were all over the place. It was an EU project, so they were not all in the city where they were based. They were kind of scattered across different cities in different countries. And they wanted to engage with these people, but they couldn't be there all the time. They couldn't be doing ethnographies in 5 different cities. They didn't have the scope to do that. So they came up with this method whereby they wanted to leave things with their participants. And they wanted these things to be a bit like a gift, I suppose, a bit something to make them think, something to excite them, something to keep them interested in the research. The things that they gave them were maps and postcards with questions and disposable cameras and things that they could kind of appropriate. So they were quite ambiguous things. They could be used in different ways. They could be filled in different ways. There was no real clear sense. It wasn't like the diary study that I just described, where it was like, okay, use this for a week, fill it in every day, give it back to me in a week, and we'll talk about it. It's much more open-ended when you're using prose. Now, there's been lots of papers about cultural prose and whether they've been used and misused appropriately. Because it's such an ambiguous method, people interpret it in different ways. And some people kind of seem to take the approach that a cultural prose pack is essentially a map, some postcards, and a disposable camera. And thus, what you should do is give your participants a map, some postcards, and a disposable camera, and you're on your way, you're using cultural prose. And that's not really what the method is about. So, Conor Graham et al. Have written a really nice paper, I think, about cultural prose, which was published in OSCI. They reflect on why it is that these things work and what it is that they do. So I'm just going to kind of talk you through this paper, but if you're interested in using this method, I would really recommend that you read this and that you read Kirsten Boner's paper on prose as well, because those are two really good resources that reflect on the way that they've been appropriated over the years. So, first of all, I'm stating the obvious, but prose work because they are capture artifacts. So, cameras, maps, post-its, but other things as well. So, Jane Wallace has done some work with people with dementia, where she created a family tree that they got to complete. And she made some brooches out of fabric from old dresses that the person with dementia wore. So they could be very, very different things. But they're things that allow you to gather data. This data is often a kind of autobiographical account. So these are not kind of ways of understanding specific things often. They're often ways of kind of opening up autobiographical stories. And that might give you insights into the routines of the everyday life, or, for example, what everyday circumstances are like. So people might go around taking photos of things that they encounter frequently, or places that they often go to, people that they often interact with. But they also, Bill Gaber described it as, they allowed us to tell stories about these people to each other. So if you're designers, and Bill Gaber is essentially in a design team, then probes were useful for them because they allowed them to begin to build stories about their participants and use that as an inspiration in what they were making. So you can use probes as kind of data collection, but you can also use them in design inspiration, if you like. They make the invisible visible. So, like I say, this might be people or places or things that you didn't encounter, perhaps if you were interviewing, or maybe even if you were doing an ethnography. But also things like emotions, aims, and wishes. Often probes are designed to try and get to these kinds of things, so the things that maybe are not so pragmatic. They position the participant as an expert. So they allow the participant to say, okay, this is what's important to me, this is how I'm going to interpret this, and I'm going to show you these things. So the ambiguity of them means that you're kind of you're handing it over to the participant, if you like, you're saying, okay, tell me what you want to tell me, rather than, I'm going to ask you a series of questions and I want you to answer them. And the idea here really is that you begin to open up dialogue and conversation. So they're a starting point. And often people have conversations around probes afterwards. Jane Wallace in her practice often makes probes iteratively. So she might make something and have a conversation or look at the completed probe with the participant, and then she might make something else. And she sees the making as part of this dialogue. You're trying to put yourself across as someone that's deserving of the participant's effort in completing the probes. Probes are not easy things to complete. They are time-consuming. They are like projects for the participants. So if they're going to do these things for you, she likes to put the work in making the probes, making these beautiful things for these participants as a kind of ongoing dialogue. So what probes do, well, they're a very humanising kind of research. So they encourage people to make very personal accounts. But these accounts are fragmentary, so you're not getting the whole picture with probes. It's not like an ethnography where you're trying to really understand everything. You're really kind of just getting the things that the participant chooses to tell you, and these might be quite small fragments that they've picked out as particularly meaningful. And they work on uncertainty, so there's an ambiguity in what the participant's supposed to do. And there's an ambiguity in how you interpret them as a researcher. They might have appropriated them in quite an unexpected way. And this working out is often something that's done in follow-up interviews, so where the participants and the researchers sit down together and try and figure out, okay, so what would a design be, or what would a technology do for me? So it's very much a kind of collaborative process, if you like. So I'll just give you now 2 examples where probes have been used in research. Conor Bain talks about 2 in this paper. So the first is in a care setting. This was they were tasked with designing for a care home, and it was a care home where people who were kind of former psychiatric patients were staying. So some of these people had schizophrenia, for example. It wasn't the kind of place where you could go and do an ethnography. You couldn't have strangers in this care facility. It was something that would be problematic for the patients. So they had to come up with different ways of trying to gather data from, they eventually decided, the staff that worked in this space. So they gave them a probe pack, which was of a photo diary, a message book, an ideas book for things that new technologies that might help the staff, a disposable camera, and some post-its. And the ultimate aim here was to support the design of a message display. So what they found was that participants did some of these things and not others. So for example, they didn't do anything with the ideas book, just didn't get a look in at all. But they did take lots of photos of ways that they shared information. So by doing that, they allowed the researchers access to things that they couldn't really get access to in any other way. They couldn't go to the site, so they couldn't experience these things. They were reliant on the staff taking photos of things that they felt were really crucial in their information practices. And the other effect that it had was making the participant quite reflective on their information practices. So where they had information, how they exchanged it amongst the staff, how they kind of had access to phone numbers, just very mundane things actually. The kind of thing that actually maybe you would normally do with an ethnography if you could access the site, was what came out of this study. But it meant that they could begin to design something for this team and then begin the kind of iterative process of user-centered design. The second example he gives is a project which was looking at intimacy. It was looking at long-term relationships and couples and how they communicated. So here, people were asked to keep diaries of their daily communication. They had a scrapbook that they kept together, and they had a camera, a printer, and some labels with prompts that they could complete, but they didn't have to complete. And here again, this kind of served as a focus for an open-ended interview. And what happened here was that this couple, or the couple that is used as an example in this paper, communicated a lot, but about very kind of lightweight things. So meeting up for lunch, what time the train was going to be going home, and just kind of calling each other quite a lot with very short periods of time. And what they found was that they got a bit self-conscious about this when they were writing it down in the diary, and were thinking, why are we so in touch all the time? Isn't this a bit much? And they initially changed their practices, so began to communicate less, and then realised that actually their relationship kind of depended on those small kind of being in touch moments, and eventually kind of balanced out and began to communicate more again. So what was quite interesting here was that it led to this reflection by the participants. They began to reflect on their own behaviour, learn something about themselves, and then eventually kind of recalibrate back to where they started. So both of these projects are ways of trying to get data where data is difficult to gather. So in a care home, or when you're looking at something like the relationship practices of a couple, these are things where you can't really necessarily go in just with one interview perhaps, get to the bottom of a situation. You need to do something a bit more subtle, maybe a bit more ambiguous and a bit more playful in some of these situations as well. So that's what these researchers have done here. But I just wanted to finish before lunch with one final example, which is where probes can be used as a means of data collection. So a bit more kind of maybe the kind of research that you might be used to. So in this study, Daniela Petrelli and her colleagues were interested in how you might support memory in the long term. So this is in a context where people are creating life logging devices or ways of capturing memories quite passively. So for example, you might have a wearable camera that records an image every 10 seconds. Maybe Google Glass is like the next potential device that could do something like this. So you have potentially cues to memory stored. And they were kind of interested in what the active process here might be. So what would you want to know? If you were looking back in 25 years' time, what would you want to know? How would you go about remembering that? Why would you want to remember it? And how might that happen? And what they did was they gave them some probes, and especially a time capsule to make as a family that would be opened in 25 years' time. So do you all know what a time capsule is? Yeah, like a kind of plastic bottle or something that you kind of put stuff in and then bury it, and then in 25 years' time you dig it up and you see what's in there. That was the kind of idea here. So what they did with this was they asked people to make these time capsules, and then after about a month they brought the time capsule to the researchers and unpacked it and told them about all the objects within it. And Petrelli et al. Then transcribed these interviews. They kind of labelled key phrases, they did some affinity diagramming, and they did basically a thematic analysis. And especially they were looking at the different kinds of objects that had been included and what they referred to. So, what was quite interesting in this research was that a lot of the objects were made, so they made especially for the time capsule. So they were things like they would write a story about a tree in their garden, or they'd go and take a photo of something that they encountered every day, or they'd write a poem, or they'd write a list of things they wanted to do in 25 years' time, so they could open the time capsule and see if they'd done any of them or not. So this kind of thing, quite creative and playful things, were often the things that found their way into the time capsule. And then they also had things like collected objects, so for example receipts or tickets or quite mundane things, things that you normally throw away, made it into the time capsule. And some of them were kind of cherished possessions, so things that they wanted to keep or things that they felt were important went in. And Petrelli et al. Basically used their findings as an argument against this idea that life and capturing memory cues should be a passive thing. So they looked at this kind of statistic whereby 37% of the things that went into the time capsule were made especially for it, and argued that memory and future memories, if you want to support future memory, this is a much more active process than simply just capturing everything that happens to you and storing it in a large computer hard drive. So they kind of took the current argument about life logging and sort of turned it on its head on the basis of their findings. So just to finish then, when we think about probes, and hopefully this has been clear by the kind of variety of things that I've talked about, they're not really a reproducible method. So it's not the case that you can just take a map and some postcards and a disposable camera, give them to your participants and see what happens. You need to think much more carefully about what to design to give out to get the interesting findings that you're looking for. How you're going to introduce them to people, and how you're going to get insights from them. So the time capsule is a really nice example where they had something very specific in mind that they wanted to build on. Obviously, you need to apply some subjective interpretation. So this isn't really an objective scientific method. This is about opening up possibilities rather than problem solving. And fundamentally, it's a way of beginning a conversation between a researcher and a participant that can then be expanded into a design work. So often it's a route into design, it's something that can be quite inspirational, something that can foster surprise and break preconceptions. I'm going to finish there. Has anyone got any questions before we go to lunch? Or you can ask me in the break if you feel more comfortable than that. Any questions? Yeah.
No.
You go first.
I came across also some other probes, for example, technology probes. What's the difference with these ones essentially?
Yeah, so what's the difference between cultural probes and technology probes? So technology probes, I think, is it Hillary Hutchinson, I think, is the paper that first describes those. And the idea there is that you put in a kind of, not a prototype because it's a technology probe, but it's similar. It's a sort of similar thing. The idea is you put in a working technology to someone's home that's then used as the basis of a co-design. So the idea is it's unfinished. The same way that the probes might be slightly ambiguous, unfinished, you build something, you deploy it. It's not the same as deploying a prototype and evaluating it. You're expecting to change things, and it might be that it's not even a design that you really expect to work, but it's going to help you understand or help you along the way to designing something that you believe will work. So it's a slightly different thing.
How do you analyze data?
From the probes?
Yeah, because I found it very subjective.
Yeah, it is very subjective, and it depends on what you're trying to do. So I think with Petrelli's example, she did a thematic analysis. So it was about using the probes to elicit stories and subjecting that to a thematic analysis and then pulling something out of it. But I think you could equally use them as a kind of point of inspiration in design work. So then you might not analyse them in the same way at all. You might, for example, pull out some compelling ideas that have been presented back to you and use that as a way of building something. So it's not necessarily something that you would have to analyse in a rigorous way, although you could. So it's a very open-ended method in terms of how you would approach analysis. Any other questions? Okay. Okay. I think I'll make a start. I guess people might drift in, but I'll get going. Okay, so in this session, what I wanted to do was cover a couple more techniques. It'll probably take about half an hour or so, and then get you to do some practice. I want you to have a go at gathering data from each other. So as a starting point though, in this next bit, I was going to talk about different ways of kind of prompting stories, maybe in an interview context. So I'm going to give an example of a study that uses a number of these strategies basically, but you could use these in different ways. So for example, you might ask people to draw a map. This could be a conceptual map. For example, I might ask someone to map out where they think their digital content is stored. Is it on Dropbox? Is it on Google Drives? Is it in OneDrive? Where does it live? Or I might ask them to draw a physical map of places that they go to. I might ask people to give me a tour. So quite often researchers will ask people to give them a tour, maybe of a technology. So I might ask you to give me a tour of your website or a homepage of a particular service or your phone. But I might also ask you to give me a tour of a location. So for example, your home, I might ask you to show me where all the cherished things that you keep in your home are. I'd ask you to do something like produce a calendar, and it might be something where you're looking back at key events, or you're looking forward at things that you anticipate happening. I could ask you to react to some keywords, or maybe I'll ask you to talk about something particular, like a particular kind of possession. So some of the research in HCI more recently has been looking at the idea of heirlooms, things that you inherit. And some of the research there has asked people to describe some of the things that they've inherited and go into depth, and then thought about what that would mean if you were to inherit something digital. So there are lots of different ways I could kind of get you to talk about things in an interview context. And the study I wanted to use as an example here is by Joe Fish Kay, who was published this year at CHI. And they were interested in money. How do people think about their money? How do they save it? How do they spend it? What does this mean for technology? How can we develop tools to help them do this? So he asked people to do things like do a map of their finances. People took this very open, in a very open-ended way. So for example, some people do storm clouds with their kind of, some of the strategies they had for managing their money, kind of protecting them from the storms above. Some people do much more pragmatic things like a pie chart, which just showed, most of my money is in stock. So they did it in very different ways. He asked people to produce a calendar of their monthly financial events, so you could begin to understand how these things are linked together in time. How does one thing affect another thing? He asked people to respond to keywords depicting certain life events that might have financial consequences. So for example, if you have a baby, or if you go to college and take out a huge debt, obviously these things have consequences. Maybe you anticipate that you'll have a very well-paid job at the end of it, but there are different financial implications there. He got people to talk through all the items in their wallet. So he asked people to empty their wallet or their purse and just describe everything that was in there. And he got some really interesting stories around that, like how one woman had basically opened a store card with a very unlikely store, a kind of store I think it was basically aimed at teenagers basically, but where it was very easy to get a credit card basically in this week, which allowed her to build up her credit score in the US. So he began to sort of unravel the things that underpin their financial practices. And then he asked them to give him a tour of the places in the home where they managed their money, and also the places or the tools that they had on their computers and mobile devices, which allowed them to manage their finances as well. So the idea here was really, he talks about seeing people as other than Homo economicus. And what he really means there is that the idea that people are kind of rational decision makers and that make rational decisions about their finances has long been discredited, basically. And what he wanted to do was not try and understand them as rational decision makers, but understand the kind of decisions they make based on their emotional histories or their personal histories or their family backgrounds. So by doing these methods, by adopting this different kind of range of methods, he was able to find a number of stories that illustrated people's personal practices around money, which were quite different to the kind of rational decision making. And some of them were around thriftiness, so people who would use coupons a lot, but that was as much a kind of part of someone's identity as it was a need to be thrifty, for example. He discovered lots of collaborative practices, people looking after the finances perhaps of their partner or their children, or having some kind of awareness of how the money they were paying their children who were at university were kind of getting on with their finances. So collaborative practices were important. And he also talked about how money was very much seen as a fragmented thing. So it wasn't just that people had this much in their savings account. They had an idea that it would be used for different things. So for example, Some of it might be to invest, and some of it might be for a rainy day, but some of it might be to spend on the bills or to spend on the food shop or whatever it is. And also where it would come from was important. So maybe you have a couple who have a joint account, but the fact that money has come from one person and another person might actually still be significant. They might still have a sense of that. And he uses these findings to argue for things like financial touch. So he obviously people often log in and just have a sense of their account. They don't really do anything with technology to really manage their money, but they just log in to get a sense of what's going on. He talks a lot about the potential for kind of tangible ways of managing money. So he looked a lot at how people basically had paper-based systems rather than technological systems, and the affordances that those things offered. And he talks a bit about collaboration and privacy and how you might begin to balance those things. So what this topic offers really is a way of tackling a topic which is actually quite awkward to talk about. It's quite difficult to go into someone's home and start interviewing them about their finances. It's not something that people are really that ready to disclose. And obviously there's a sense that you might be doing your finances in a way that's right or wrong. So he talks about the map as being really useful here. You can't really get drawing a map wrong. So he tried to start with something that would allow people to approach this in a way that they felt that they could do it in any way that they wanted, that they wouldn't really make a mistake. They could just kind of answer the question as they felt was the right way. The other advantage here is that they enabled very rich responses. So we got a number of really evocative stories out of people that allowed him to see finance in a slightly different way than you might if you asked someone a more kind of rational set of questions about how you manage your money. So any questions about those techniques? Okay, in that case I'm just going to move on to the last one, which is really beginning to think about user-generated content as potentially examples of narratives that you might find on web-to-row sites, so for example YouTube or Twitter or Facebook. All of these places contain a wealth of data which could be of use in HCI. So I want to particularly draw attention to a paper by Mark Blythe and Paul Keynes, where they looked at user-generated content and explored different ways of trying to analyse it, basically. And in particular, they focused on the iPhone. So they suggest that user-generated content on sites such as YouTube, Facebook, and MySpace offer researchers in many fields unprecedented access to new forms of data. And they, in this paper, try and explore what you might do with that data. Okay. So they take a number of approaches here. The first one is reasonably straightforward. They take as the iPhone and YouTube as their starting point in this research. And they simply look at the first 100 videos that are returned if you search for iPhone 3G. And then they do a content analysis of them. So they try and understand what does YouTube basically have to say about the iPhone on its launch. And so they come up with a number of categories. So you have basically reviews of the technology, people just kind of reviewing the iPhone, comparing it to the iPhone 2G, etc. Reportage, so people looking at the cues, the kind of hype around the launch of this product. Unboxing videos. I don't know if you've seen any of these. It's where people open a box on YouTube and film it and give a commentary. But incredibly common. There are thousands of these on YouTube. And then also some more satirical videos. So people, kind of trying to create something funny for the YouTube audience. So that's quite a straightforward way of how you might begin to deal with this kind of data. But then they sort of argue, well, there are more interesting things you can potentially do with this kind of content. So the second thing that they attempt is a grounded theory analysis of comments posted to a particular video, which is in a series of videos where people blend technologies or other things, but lots of things they blend with technologies. So has anyone seen these videos? They're called Will It Blend? Yeah. And they're part of a kind of broader scope of things where people microwave technologies or drop them from high places, etc. Yeah, so they do a random theory analysis of comments posted to this video and try and understand the reaction to it, basically. And basically they end up with three categories, where people kind of express confusion as to why we would blend this clone, dismay, but also celebration, so kind of celebrating the fact that this product is being destroyed. And they argue that that's sort of interesting. You can begin to understand how people can react to this kind of user-generated content. But they then attempt a third thing, which is to do a hermeneutic interpretation. So here they're really looking at meaning rather than just classifying things. So grounded theory allows you to come up with these kinds of categories and put things into them. But they argue that perhaps what we're more interested in is to draw on fields such as critical theory, whereby people kind of deal with media and art in different ways. So they, as an example, and I don't think they're trying to say that their interpretation is correct, they're just sort of exploring what you might do with these kinds of data in the paper. But they do one of these kind of critical readings. So they look at this Will It Blend video again, and videos like it, videos where you microwave the technology or otherwise destroy it. And they produce 3 different readings based on a critical theory approach, which is where you basically look for the meaning. What do you think this video really means? So the first reading they produce is related to a reaction against consumerism. So they argue, well, perhaps these kinds of videos whereby you destroy these beautiful products that people spend a lot of time saving up for is a kind of argument against consumerism. Perhaps we shouldn't be consuming all this stuff. And they draw on kind of arguments relating to sustainability, whereby the amount of technology we go through in our lifetimes is, well, incredible. Now the idea of critical theory isn't just to produce one reading, so then they produce a second reading, which is to say, well, actually, maybe this is a celebration of consumerism, because once you've destroyed your technology, you can go out and buy the next one. So the problem isn't really that you're destroying it, it's just what to do with the body when the new version comes out. And then the third reading is a kind of synthesis of the two, where they say, well, the problem is that you kind of recognise the difficulties of consuming all this technology, but you produce a video to make yourself feel better about it, but you don't actually really deal with the problem. So here they're just kind of borrowing from critical theory to sort of begin to think about, well, how might you deal with this data? But I think the question that they're really trying to get to is, well, what new methods do we need for dealing with these kinds of data? Dealing with user-generated content, we don't really have a good way of tackling it. So there are some examples in the paper, but really what I want you to take from this is that there is this data there, and I think we need to be looking beyond HGI in terms of how we deal with it. Okay, so what I want you to do now is think about the kind of possibilities and challenges associated with user-generated content. And this could be content on YouTube or on social network sites, places like Flickr. And I want you to think about what the possibilities are for research, but also what the challenges are in using it. Just spend 5 minutes and then we'll be back. Okay, should we be back?
Yeah.
Okay, so does someone want to start us off with some of the possibilities? What might you do with this content?
So, possibility, great way to sidestep a lot of observation effects. So if the content is already generated and then you're doing research on it, you're getting sort of a pure version of data that you might not get the same way if they knew they were creating it for a researcher.
So it's created for a different audience than research, which is potentially interesting. Okay. What else? What are the other? Yeah.
The access to the content is quite easy and cheap.
Yeah. But well, yeah. Cheap in terms of that it's there.
Yeah, already. So yeah.
And the
exactly.
area of our research is without limits. Yeah, limitless.
So it's a very broad data set there.
Yeah.
Potentially limitless. Yeah.
The pool is huge, and then it could be very creative. Every type of content will come, which leads us also to find what's relevant and what's not relevant. So how do you organize that to create dimensionality, reduction, visualization of it? Because you know how many people
Yeah.
will
So
use what.
So it's huge, and that can have advantages but also challenges, perhaps. Like how do you deal with it, and perhaps visualize it or analyze it once you get there.
Quality.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else?
We also discussed some of the challenges. So you don't know the context when the person wrote that. You don't know the person, so interpreting what does this content means, and the motivation for writing. So, and in the same, is it really, so in terms of validity, this user could be a fake, like marketing purposes, so not sure if it's and we also had this ethical concern because the data wasn't created for research purpose. If we are allowed to just take it, and what about informed consent if they don't use their own name? Then you can't get in so contact them, for example. And also if you want to use, so there's this debate in ethnography about public space or copyright, and if you can use it like in verbatim quotes. And some users in online blogs or communities, they don't use their real name, but they are really well known with their alter ego, for example. So there's this challenge between, okay, it's like copyright, it's an author, so we should cite this person. On the other hand, anonymity, and it's a challenge.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting space in terms of ethics, and what are the ethics of analysing data which hasn't been produced for research. Can you just go in and analyse it? How do you then report your findings if you decide that it's okay to do that analysis? So yeah, really interesting kind of spaces there. Okay, any other challenges?
Well, it's the same. People can behave really differently depending on the area and the level of anonymity. So one person might, it just like you can never know if that is truth or it's complete lie. It just so many variables that influence it, and it really changes from person to person. So it's questionable how much trust you can put and how much validity this data collectively like this actually have.
Yeah, so you don't really know much about the data itself to be able to have a sense of whether it's valid.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, we've got on the one hand this sort of incredible resource, but on the other hand something where actually data analysis becomes really difficult. It's impossible to be exhaustive. You can't analyse every video on YouTube, so you're going to have to make a selection based on something, and the selection is likely to change every week. If you stay do the top 100 hits, it's going to be constantly in flux. One of the interesting things that Mark Blythe sort of talks about is how some things you might have a topic, you might have a tension between the topic and the medium. So he talks about the unboxing videos, there being so many of them, because it is this kind of dramatic moment where you can lift the lid and it may lend itself to film. So maybe the things you get on YouTube are things that lend themselves to film. You're going to get a certain kind of class of data, if you like. And then you begin to run into these problems of analysis with some of these forms of data. So how do you analyse satire? How do you analyse a song? How would you even know where to start with these things? And then finally, yes, ethics. Seems to be a very muddy area actually as to what's the appropriate way of dealing with this data. Okay, so I'm just going to summarise reasons to use narrative. So we've talked a lot about context today, how stories draw in a lot of context, temporal context, place, what happened next, who was there. So a good way of pulling in all of these kinds of information in quite a natural way, a way that's very natural to people. It's very easy to tell stories across time, so to pull things together. We've talked about how these methods might be used for dealing with sensitive topics, so things like intimacy or finance. Maybe getting access to areas where it would be difficult to get in there otherwise, like a secure care unit. Another one of the reasons is that it can put control in the hands of the participants. So again, with these quite tricky topics, you're kind of putting control back in their hands rather than asking them a very kind of focused series of questions. And we've also talked about stories might be inspirational in grounding design. So allowing designers to tell stories about their participants can be a good way of supporting inspiration. So, one caveat though, talk is not straightforward. So when people tell stories, the things that they say are not always the things they mean. So the context, I think, is really important. So this is a kind of typical example. Someone might say, I have back pain, and they might mean a number of things. They might mean that they have back pain, but they might mean that they haven't been able to do their exercises and they're making excuses. Or they might mean that they need some sympathy from you. So they might be trying to get to a number of things. And this is exactly what we found in the study that I talked about web use earlier. If you say, someone says, very simply, I'm checking my email, that can mean a number of things. They might be waiting for an email. They might always check their email when they sit down at their computer. They might be bored and flicking to an email just as an escapism. So context is really important, and using stories to get to that content, to build what's around a statement, is really valuable. And finally, well, we've talked a lot about qualitative data and narrative being a qualitative thing. A lot of the studies I've talked about have also used quantitative data. So this isn't an either-or thing. It's not that you should be using qualitative narrative and thinking, I'm not interested in statistics. A lot of the studies that we've used have either produced categories based on qualitative data and then counted things within those categories, or they've used statistics to infer something about a framework that they've developed. So for example, in the AR study we talked about, people surveyed experience so that they could look at what qualities of experience mirrored to what kinds of experience. And of course you need to take this into account at the beginning. When you design your study, you need to be thinking, well, do I want to do any further data analysis on this? And if so, what is that and how am I going to catch that data? Right. So to summarise what we've talked about, gone over a number of techniques. The critical incident technique, where you ask someone about a remarkable instance of something, be that a particularly satisfying experience or particularly unsatisfying experience. We talked about diaries as potential prompts for stories and narratives. We talked about how you might use other prompts in the context of an interview, so for example the maps, tours, calendars. We talked a bit about cultural probes, and how you might use those to elicit stories or foster a dialogue with a participant. And then we've talked a bit about user-generated data and how some of the narratives around that might be fodder for research, but might not be, depending on if you can figure out a way to analyse them and if you can do so in an ethical way. But together, these techniques can be used to elicit narratives both about remarkable events but also unremarkable events of the everyday. They enable those narratives to be worked out in a dialogue with the participants. and they can entail an examination of existing data, so user-generated data that's already out there. And all of these can be appropriated, so there's no particular right way or correct way of doing any of these. You need to bend them to your own will for your research. So, if you have any questions about the techniques, do you want to? Okay. So I thought next we could have a practice of the critical incident technique, given that it's quite small. You just need to come up with one question to ask one other person, and I thought you could be your own participants. So what I wanted you to do was, yeah, you can just answer the question. I want you to think about this as a potential research question. I want you to think about music streaming services and how they influence the ways you experience music, or people experience music. So things like Spotify, Xbox Music, Pandora, all of these things whereby you experience music in a very different way than perhaps people did 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 50 years ago. So I would like you to get into groups of maybe 3 or 4 and just come up with a question in the critical incident technique. How would you frame a question to understand this? And then what you're going to do is spend about half an hour, or maybe not half an hour, maybe a bit less than half an hour, but you're going to interview each other. So I want you to kind of swap groups if you like. So everyone in a group can interview someone in another group and then be interviewed. So you will ask someone your critical incident question, and then you will answer their critical incident question. Does this make sense? No?
Because I don't know how to run the mini study.
You think what?
How to run the mini study?
Well, that's just going to be asking a question and answering a question. It's going to be a very mini study. Very mini. So, okay, so in groups of maybe 3 or 4, come up with a question to elicit the critical incident around the You've got 10 minutes.
Yes.
You've got until 10 minutes.